Welcome to a special presentation about the New Hampshire Northcoast Railroad, its history and significance. The goal here is to share with you a bit about the history and significance of New Hampshire Northcoast Corporation Railroad, also known as NHN, mitigate the adverse effects on a New Hampshire historic resource caused by the rehabilitation of Haven Hill Road Bridge in Rochester, and outline the major rehabilitation project currently underway. New Hampshire Northcoast Infrastructure Project 2020 Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements CRISI grant. This major infrastructure improvement project to the New Hampshire Northcoast Rail Line will address safety requirements, improve service to customers, and improve operating efficiency at an estimated total cost of approximately $6.5 million, 70% from a Federal Railroad Administration grant and 30% funded privately by New Hampshire Northcoast and a contribution from Eastern Propane. The main infrastructure improvements along the 42 miles of track include replacing 18,000 ties, raising, resurfacing, and replacing obsolete rail, and installing 6,500 tons of ballast. Construction of a new spur track at Eastern Propane Storage Facility at Tri-City Industrial Park in Rochester will increase tanker capacity on site, which will alleviate the need to store propane tanker cars on a siding in downtown Somersworth during the busy winter months. At the Rollingsford Yard, an old track will be reconstructed to provide storage of propane cars and improve sand loading capabilities and switching operations. The Rocky Hill Road Grade Crossing Project upgrade in Somersworth will add electronic signals and bells. It's currently protected by only stop signs and crossbucks. This safety improvement addresses increasing traffic at the crossing due to residential development in the area. All of these infrastructure improvements will increase operational safety, but the rehabilitation of Haven Hill Road Bridge in Rochester is the most critical. The low 11-foot clearance of the underpass has caused numerous overheight vehicle collisions with the bridge, carrying the tracks overhead. The steel girders, damaged from truck collisions, date from 1913. They rest on stone abutments likely dating to 1849. The bridge was determined eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places in 2019. This is one of many trucks severely damaged from hitting the Haven Hill Road Bridge. Vehicle impacts to the beams of Haven Hill Road Bridge threaten NHN's ability to safely haul the 100-ton rail cars, with each train containing as many as 30 cars. A new precast concrete bridge will be installed on the existing historic stone abutments, raising clearance from 11 to 14 feet. A trough-type bridge with stone ballast fill specifically designed for railroad use will provide additional safety features and allow trains to maintain speed when crossing it. Construction of the NHN infrastructure project began in 2024. Chapter 2: Origins of the New Hampshire Northcoast Railroad Line. The opening of a branch of the Boston and Maine Railroad into Somersworth in 1843 sparked the creation of the Great Falls and Conway Railroad, the original predecessor of New Hampshire Northcoast Railroad. By 1840, America was in the grip of the railroad building frenzy. Boston and Maine Railroad and Eastern Railroad were racing to build lines between Portland and Boston, and to extend branches to capture the markets in growing industrial cities like Somersworth and Rochester, New Hampshire. Eastern Railroad investors chartered the Great Falls and South Berwick Branch Railroad in 1841 to connect their main line at Brooks Crossing, Maine, with Great Falls in Somersworth, but could not obtain financing. Here is the original charter, which is currently in the Somersworth Historical Society Museum. Meanwhile, the better-financed Boston and Maine Railroad obtained rights to extend a branch from their main line at Rollinsford, New Hampshire, to Great Falls in Somersworth. Construction of the line was completed in 1843, terminating at this grand station, built in the Greek Revival style, erected between the tracks and Main Street. Eastern countered the B&M with its own ambitious plan. In 1844, the Great Falls and Conway Railroad was chartered to run from Somersworth to the White Mountains. From the B&M station in Somersworth, the line would run west to Rochester, and then north through Milton, Wakefield, Ossipee, Tamworth, and Madison to Conway. Construction of the line began in 1848 and opened in Rochester, a distance of 6.3 miles, on March 6, 1849. This 1877 bird's-eye map of Rochester shows the Great Falls and Conway station at the junction with the B&M line on Hanson Street. The Great Falls and Conway was the first to reach Rochester. The Cocheco Railroad, Boston and Maine, and Portland and Rochester railroads soon followed. The railroads had a profound impact on the economy and growth of the city. Rochester became a busy junction of rail lines and branches to neighboring towns like Gonnick, where bricks were made from vast clay deposits dumped there by the glaciers. The railroads made Gonnick the largest producer of bricks in New Hampshire. In 1889, 24 million bricks were produced annually at 5 factories by 360 workers using 66 horses. That year, the Rochester Courier reported, quote, "More bricks and better bricks are made in Rochester than in any other town." These high-quality, kiln-fired bricks were shipped by rail all over the Northeast and beyond. Gonnick bricks built many main streets, churches, and mills, as well as the campuses at UNH, Yale, MIT, and Harvard, and the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. Construction of the Great Falls in Conway continued north out of Rochester, reaching South Milton just over 5 miles away in November 1850. Financial problems and difficult terrain slowed work to a crawl. The crossing of Great Brook in North Milton required a timber trestle, 200 feet long, 70 feet high, with massive stone abutments. The trestle was later replaced with a monumental stone arch bridge that stands today. With textile mills already established at Upper and Lower Falls on the Salmon River, Milton was a ready customer for the railroad and provided the means for a dramatic expansion of the Milton businesses. The railroads allowed the large-scale movement of ice cut from Milton's vast ponds each winter. In 1858, the booming Milton ice business began with the first ice train to Boston. Huge ice storehouses and rail cars were insulated with sawdust that allowed ice to be stored and shipped throughout the hot summer months. In 1913, the advertised price of delivering ice to Boston during the summer was $3 to $4 per ton, and another 85 cents per ton in freight charges, as weighed in Milton. In 1880, the Granite State Ice Company shipped 600 tons of ice each day to the South Boston Brewing Company. With quality ice and easy rail access, the competition was fierce. More than a dozen ice companies operated in Milton at various times. From 1900 to 1928, there were 5 large ice companies in Milton, including the Porter, Metropolitan, Union, and Boston Ice Companies. One of the biggest, the Lynn Ice House, shown here, was in Lebanon, Maine, across the pond from downtown Milton and the B&M Railroad Depot. Lynn Ice had 11 ice houses and 2 elevators. The growth of electric refrigeration in the 1930s and 40s spelled the eventual end of the ice companies in Milton, but the business was still robust in this 1925 photo showing large-scale ice cutting. The ice was floated to elevator stacks that moved the ice into the storehouses. In 1855, construction of the rail line continued north, reaching Union Village in Wakefield. Eastern Railroad was funding the work with bonds and was out of credit. 15 years and the Civil War would pass before the push to Conway would resume. To reduce operating costs, Eastern dusted off the charter of the Great Falls and South Berwick Branch Railroad and built the line, bypassing the B&M and eliminating trackage rights paid to B&M to reach Somersworth. Completed in 1855, the branch paralleled the B&M south out of Somersworth, then veered east into Maine. The branch was abandoned in the 20th century. New Hampshire Northcoast owns and runs on the old B&M branch, making it the oldest section of their line, built between 1842 and 43. Original passenger tickets of the Great Falls and Conway Railroad dated September 23, 1857, and the newly formed Portsmouth Great Falls and Conway Railroad dated November 12, 1866. The 1850s were unprofitable for both the Great Falls and Conway and the Great Falls and South Berwick Railroads. The Eastern Railroad foreclosed on their loans and took ownership of both lines in 1861. With the end of the Civil War in 1865, the Portsmouth Great Falls and Conway Railroad was formed to take over the charters of the Great Falls and Conway and the Great Falls and South Berwick Railroads and continued building to Conway. Failing to raise construction money, the trains continued to be met in Union by stagecoaches to haul travelers to Conway and the White Mountains. In 1870, the Eastern leased the Portsmouth, Great Falls, and Conway and resumed construction. Hitchings and Sawyer, railroad contractors from Portland, Maine, were hired to begin work on the final 44 miles of track to North Conway. As the work pushed north in 1871 with a large workforce, Sawyer was returning from Portland with the company's wages. Near Porter, Maine, as reported by the Lewiston Evening Journal, quote, he was robbed by a party of highwaymen in the most high-handed manner of about $4,500. 3 men sprang from the bushes. One held a pistol to Sawyer's head and demanded he give up his money or he would, quote, blow his brains out. The men, quote, must have had some knowledge of Mr. Sawyer's having the money beforehand, it was reported. The robbery, equal to nearly $150,000 today, was apparently never solved. Despite the setback, work pushed on. A major station was built at Sanbornville where a branch line to Wolfboro was extended. Additional stations were built along the route through Wakefield, Ossipee, and Conway. The line opened to Ossipee in 1871, to Conway that December, and to North Conway on June 3, 1872. 44 miles of track were laid in just over 1 year of work. The Eastern celebrated the railroad's virtues, advertising it as the shortest, quickest, and only route to North Conway and the White Mountains. When it opened, the fare for a trip from Boston to North Conway was only $5. The line was officially the Conway branch of Eastern Railroad, but the public knew it as the Portsmouth Great Falls and Conway line. The Eastern kept the original name until the end, which was fast approaching. In 1875, the Portland and Ogdensburg Railroad, building west, and the Boston, Concord, and Montreal, building east, connected at Crawford Notch. The Portsmouth, Great Falls, and Conway Railroad connected as well, giving Eastern investors access to Montreal and the vast new markets of the West. The Eastern embarked on a modernization program through the 1870s that included faster locomotives, new bridges, more maintenance, and better safety equipment. Debt grew to nearly $15 million, and fed-up stockholders forced a reorganization in 1876. New bonds were issued, and bankruptcy was held off. In the cities served by both the Eastern and the Boston and Maine, like Rochester and Somersworth, the stiff competition was eating up Eastern's profits. Heated stockholders called for leasing the Eastern to the B&M. In 1884, the deal was done. The lease was short. Consolidation promised greater cost-cutting and profits. Finally, in 1890, the Eastern Railroad and the Portsmouth Great Falls and Conway were acquired by the Boston and Maine, and new stock issued to shareholders. The end of two important New Hampshire railroads marked the beginning of the tremendous growth of the B&M into New England's largest transportation network. Chapter 3. The Boston and Maine Railroad, Conway Branch. The stunning growth of the Boston and Maine into New England's biggest railroad system began with state laws passed in the 1880s, clearing the way for unbridled railroad consolidation. Regarding New Hampshire's 1889 Railroad Acts, the state railroad commissioners said, quote, "Such an aggregation of capital and power would have terrified the citizens of New Hampshire no longer than 10 years ago." The acts settled a battle for control of dozens of independent railroads. 5 consolidated systems were authorized, but just the Boston and Maine and the Concord and Montreal would control 90% of the state's railroads. By 1900, all the railroads in New Hampshire, totaling 1,076 miles, were under B&M control, except for one. The Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad, part of Canada's powerful Grand Trunk system with just 52 miles passing through the state, could not be bought. This B&M 1898 route map dramatizes the sweep of the New Hampshire takeover. Meanwhile, after buying Eastern in 1890, B&M launched an improvement program to address deferred maintenance, upgrade the track to carry heavier locomotives, and to improve passenger experience. The roadbed was rebuilt with treated ties and heavier rails, wood beam bridges were replaced with steel, and new stations and yards were built. The early 20th century brought increased passenger and freight revenue for the B&M Conway branch. Unprecedented cartloads of ice from Milton and sawn timber from the mountains was moving by train. Easy train access gave reason to build more and grander resorts in the White Mountains, which increased tourist ridership. Sanbornville, in Wakefield, where the Wolfboro line branched off, became an important hub, with a roundhouse, repair shops, freight house, and a division office. Shown here in 1906, the Sanbornville shops and roundhouse burned in 1911. Between 1907 and World War I, the Boston and Maine Railroad ran on 2,364 miles of rail, with over 25,000 employees. 2 major accidents on B&M's northern branch in 1907 were caused by train crews confusing station names in their orders. Canaan with West Canaan, and Haverhill with East Haverhill. New Hampshire Railroad Commissioners ordered 29 stations in the state to change similar or easily confused names, including 7 stations on the Conway branch. B&M's rolling stock, building stock, rails, ties, and under-track structures continued to be upgraded during the early 20th century. In 1912, the original 1855 Union Station in Wakefield was replaced to meet growing ridership. B&M carried 38.5 million passengers in 1901. By 1913, they carried 50 million. Ridership peaked at 55 million in 1920, and then began a steady decline, reflecting increasing automobile ownership. In 1901, the average train load was 202 tons. By 1924, 472 tons. Today, it's 2,800 tons. Around 1912, B&M began another program of bridge upgrades to carry new, heavier locomotives. Haven Hill Road Bridge in Rochester, built in 1913, and Old Wakefield Road Bridge in Milton, seen here, built in 1917, are 2 such examples on the Conway branch. In 1924, B&M formed the Boston and Maine Transportation Company to operate motor coaches, quote, to provide service in new territories or to extend or supplement service now given by passenger trains. Service in New Hampshire began the following year. The Depression dramatically shrank passenger and freight revenue. B&M ordered innovative diesel-electric locomotives with a radical aerodynamic shell built of molded stainless steel. The streamlined design became immensely popular, offering hope that speed and technology would lead us out of the Depression. B&M took control of Maine Central Railroad in 1933, upping its track miles to nearly 3,000. The Flying Yankee began service in 1935 between Bangor and Boston under the Maine Central banner. It was capable of speeds over 100 miles per hour. Another plan to gain back ridership was to promote the safety of train travel. Between 1920, when train ridership began steadily declining, and 1936, motor vehicle fatalities per year increased over 330%, from about 11,000 to over 36,000. This 1936 B&M advertisement touts the train's advantages. No sudden death, no children crippled for life, no fathers lost to families, no mothers taken from loved ones. The ad continues with a statistic, quote, "During the past 17 years, this railroad has carried 572,551,426 passengers without a single fatality." By far, the most successful idea to generate new passenger revenue in the Depression was B&M's snow train, to carry winter sports enthusiasts to the northern reaches of New England. For decades, trains in Europe had carried winter tourists and sporters into the Alps. B&M would be the first to do it here. Members of the Appalachian Mountain Club brought the idea to the B&M in 1930 as a means to further their winter activities of snowshoeing, mountaineering, and the new sport of cross-country skiing. B&M's first winter sports Sunday train debuted in 1931, carrying 196 passengers from Boston to Warner, New Hampshire. A year later, with a new name, snow trains carried thousands into the White Mountains, first to Lincoln, then to the Eastern Slope region, direct from Boston on B&M's Conway branch. B&M snow train advertising posters would take on a variety of artistic styles. The marketing posters ranged from family fun, with Mom artfully skiing, Dad taking a tumble, and their young'un rolling a giant snowball, to those that raised eyebrows. Fun-loving, adventurous, and attractive young women continued to dominate snow train advertising into the 1940s. Even the engine was having fun. On February 22, 1936, the front page of the Boston Globe reported 250,000 going into the hills on snow trains. B&M ran 18 trains out of Boston. The New Haven ran 8 trains out of New York. Reports of the day described the scene. Quote, "There was such a crush between 4 and 4:30 p.m. at North Station yesterday that commuters had hard work getting to their trains. Skis on shoulders, poles under arms, bags or knapsacks carried somehow, thousands of sports fans jammed 2 12-car snow trains until all standing room was gone." World War II changed everything. German U-boats stopped the ocean delivery of war-critical materials, including oil, coal, and steel, to East Coast ports. The railroad industry rose to the challenge. In 1942 and 1943, B&M tripled its shipment of coal and oil, keeping New England homes and factories warm and working. Passenger volume also increased dramatically, almost reaching the peak set in 1920. After World War II, the snow trains made a brief comeback, but even at their peak, the revenue could not offset the maintenance costs of the track they ran on. New ski resorts near new highways made the snow train obsolete. B&M ended snow train service on the Conway branch in the 1950s. The wartime boom for the B&M was over. Passenger and freight revenue continued racing downhill through the 1950s. A new self-propelled diesel passenger car introduced by the Bud Company, known as Highliners, Budliners, or Bud cars, promised low operating costs. They were put in service on the Conway branch and other routes with low ridership. By 1957, Bud cars were utilized for nearly all of B&M's remaining passenger service. Steam operations ended April 22, 1956, when Boston and Maine locomotive number 3713, the Constitution, led the farewell steam excursion from Portland to Boston. This heavy Pacific-type locomotive has since been restored and is on display in Steamtown National Park in Scranton, Pennsylvania. In 1957, B&M petitioned the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission to end passenger service on its Conway, Cheshire, and Berlin branches, dropping 44 trains and closing 28 stations. The PUC refused. In 1960, B&M halted service on the Conway branch, citing the refusal of Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen to operate self-propelled Bud cars without a flagman. The PUC sided with the union, and service briefly resumed, but the red ink was overwhelming, and the abandonments of passenger service were ultimately approved. By the summer of 1961, 6 stations on the Conway branch had been sold to private individuals, and all the remaining were slated for abandonment and sale. The Twin State News-Times of Woodsville, New Hampshire, a railroad town that was hard hit and bitter about B&M's collapse, insinuated insider dealing. Quote, B&M officials purchased 2 of the stations, and Paul Manos, a favorite realtor for President Patrick B. McGinnis, purchased 4 others. On December 2, 1961, the last passenger train was run on the Conway branch. In 1966, McGinnis and 2 accomplices were sentenced to 18 months in jail for the fraudulent sale of decommissioned railroad cars and property. 4 years later, the B&M missed interest payments on $14 million in bonds and began reorganization under the Bankruptcy Act. During the shakeup, a new customer sought freight service on B&M's Conway branch. In 1969, Boston Sand and Gravel Company reached an agreement with B&M to ship concrete sand from its subsidiary, Ossipee Aggregates Corporation's gravel pit in Ossipee, to its concrete plant facility in Charlestown, Massachusetts. B&M built a mile-long sidetrack off the main line across Route 16 into the pit. On August 27, 1969, the first carloads were on their way. Sand cars kept shipping out of the Ossipee pit until August 1983, when traffic on the line north of Rochester was halted by B&M and the track embargoed, deemed unsafe at any speed. Chapter 4. Rebuilding the Line. In April 1986, NHN bought 32 miles of the Conway branch between Rochester and Ossipee from B&M. At that time, the tracks were unsafe in many places. Rotted ties, lack of ballast, and worn, broken, and misaligned rail were typical. Even at slow speeds, the track condition posed a danger of derailment in places. Spot repairs to the most critical problems were quickly made using traditional manual labor and tools. After a month of work, the line was ready to accept low-speed trains. Meanwhile, work rebuilding the track continued. Old 75 and 85-pound jointed rail was replaced with 112-pound jointed rail. This section of track at Burleyville was rebuilt on the siding alignment, easing the curve and allowing the use of track-mounted equipment working from the main line. The siding was torn up and the rail bed regraded. A track-mounted high rail crane was used to set new ties and rails. Heavier rail was delivered by the cartload to replace the lighter, worn-out rail. New ties, tie plates, and rail ready to be spiked in. The rails were aligned, spliced, gauged, and spiked by hand. Many 100-ton carloads of crushed stone, called ballast, were used to bed new sections of track and for leveling and regrading existing sections of track. A new section of track with newly laid ballast ready for compaction. Special measuring equipment checked the gauging and alignment of the track. A ballast tamper machine followed to set the uniform elevation of the track, called grade, and compact the ballast, called tamping. The ballast tampers used air-powered jackhammers to pound the ballast under and around the ties as tamper liners lifted and aligned the rails. The machine replaced men called gandy dancers, who used tamping bars called beaters, and other section hands who jacked the rail level and shoveled in ballast. By December 1986, 18 miles of track from the Ossipee Pit to Union Station in Wakefield had been rebuilt. On May 27, 1987, NHN rolled its first sand train from the Ossipee Pit to Boston. Grade crossing reconstruction was another critical safety improvement. 29 grade crossings were rebuilt and flashing signals installed at 10 locations. Several bridges required major work. In 1988, the timber trestle over Salmon Falls River in Milton was completely rebuilt, eliminating weight restrictions. With the trestle complete, a gandy dancer tunes the grade of the approach track using a beater to tamp the ballast under the ties. In October 1993, NHN acquired the remaining 10 miles of track between Rochester and Rollinsford, where the Conway branch intersected with the B&M Maine lines. Poor track conditions had limited trains to 5 miles per hour in many places. New ties, ballast, and 136 pounds of welded rail were installed. All of the remaining grade crossings were upgraded, including new electronic signals at many locations in Rochester, Somersworth, and Rollinsford. Repair and upgrade work on the line hasn't stopped since NHN's purchase of the line. They spend between $250,000 and $1 million per year on track repairs. 95% of the rail and ties have been replaced since 1986. Since 1990, all signalized crossings have been upgraded. Culverts damaged by increased runoff from development have been repaired or bypassed with a new culvert, preserving the original granite culverts when feasible. Major projects have been accomplished thanks to a mix of federal, state, municipal, and private financial assistance and participation. Chapter 5. Remains of the Day. Remaining features on the Boston and Maine Railroad Conway branch. Stations and depots were sold by B&M to private owners in the 1980s. The two remaining stations on the NHN line are Somersworth and Union. 33 railroad bridges of various types, including steel plate girder, I-beam, stone arch, stone and concrete slab, wood beam, and wood trestle. Approximately 100 culverts, including granite stone box, rail top, and various types of pipe culverts. Stone retaining walls remain at several locations. 2 small tourist-related users operate on parts of the old Conway branch north of the NHN terminus in Ossipee on state-owned rail. Conway Scenic Railway and the Conway Branch Recreational Trail. Examples of the surviving property types follow. The Somersworth station, built in 1886, now houses 2 restaurants, one at street level and one below at track level. Union Station, built in 1912, was purchased by Wakefield Heritage Commission in 2006 and carefully restored inside and out into the Heritage Park Railroad Museum. Union Station in Wakefield as it appeared in 1982 as a private home. Union Station today. Original interior details remained hidden under plasterboard to be restored and serve as patterns for replicating missing features. Turntable pit and turntable in Sanbornville. This B&M turntable from Keene was installed in 1974. Through-plate girder bridge over Old Wakefield Road in Milton. Deck plate girder bridge over Branch River in Wakefield. Rolled I-beam bridge over Salmon Falls River in Milton. Timber trestle bridge over Salmon Falls River in Milton. 22 spans on wood pile bents and stone piers. Stone box cattle pass. Stone box culvert double. Granite slab or stone lintel bridge. Stone retaining wall showing abandoned overhead pedestrian bridge. Conway Scenic Railroad, CSRX. Established in 1974, the Tourist Excursion Railroad has restored the Conway and North Conway stations and maintains bridges and other original railroad features along the line. New Hampshire Parks Conway Branch Recreational Trail. The trail is unimproved but passable on foot. These 3 stations and other features including depots, bridges, and culverts remain. Chapter 6. New Hampshire Northcoast Railroad. NHN today. NHN, established in 1986, is a 42-mile Class 3 short-line railroad. It intersects with the CSX Main Line, formerly Pan Am Railways, Springfield Terminal, Guilford Transportation, Boston and Maine, at milepost 70 in Rollinsford, runs north through Somersworth, Rochester, Lebanon, Maine, Milton, and Wakefield to Ossipee, where it ends at New Hampshire Route 28. NHN hauls primarily concrete sand and propane, as well as steel and waste oil. Trains average 25 cars, 1 round trip daily, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year. Regular freight service is also provided to Eastern Propane in Rochester, Harmac Rebar and Steel Corporation in Fryeburg, Maine, and Greenview Technologies Incorporated in Rollinsford. NHN is headquartered on Route 16 in Ossipee. The engine house, railcar maintenance shop, and side tracks are on 43 acres west of the highway. NHN runs 3 locomotives, 78 hopper cars, track maintenance equipment, and a caboose. The main office and dispatcher are located east of Route 16 at Ossipee Aggregates. The Ossipee Aggregates site consists of a quarry, sand and gravel pits, and processing plant that produces mostly concrete sand. An average of 5,200 carloads of concrete sand totaling 520,000 tons are shipped annually by rail from the Ossipee Pit. A fully loaded sand train departs the Ossipee Pit for delivery to Ossipee Aggregates Rochester Terminal and Boston Sand and Gravel. Ossipee Aggregates' 21-acre Rochester Tri-City Terminal handles 30 to 40% of the sand from the Ossipee Pit for distribution to concrete plants in the region. NHN sand cars parked at Boston Sand and Gravel, an island unto itself in Charlestown, Massachusetts. Transloading facilities serviced by NHN in Rochester, Ossipee Aggregates Rochester Terminal, and Eastern Propane Storage and Distribution Center. NHN delivers 600 to 900 tanker cars of propane to Eastern's Rochester facility annually, taking up to 5,000 tanker trucks off New Hampshire roads each year. NHN rail freight reduces truck volumes, highway maintenance, and fuel costs. 40,000 heavy trailer truck and tanker trips are taken off New Hampshire highways each year. 1.6 million truck trips have been eliminated over NHN's 38 years of operation. Fewer trucks means greater highway safety and less carbon emissions, now and in the future. End of the line.